Welcome, my soft-thinking listener. You've found yourself in the company of the Sleepy Sloth once again. A slow, scientifically minded fellow, who enjoys textiles, color symbolism, and things that brides wear on ceremonious occasions. I must tell you something before we begin. Today, I consider myself a scientist in the very subtle and quietly complex history of white wedding dresses. A scientist wannabe who is almost always correct, except for those few times when I am not. But even then, I prefer to drift gently onward, rather than fuss over it. Because what truly matters is the information itself. Before I start, please, let me know, what is the most boring thing you would secretly love hearing about? Let me know gently, in the comments. Now, let us begin today's episode of the history of white wedding dresses. In the soft, lingering hours of pre-16th century life, let us drift gently into a time when brides did not yet hold the delicate expectation of wearing white, and instead, in the quiet domestic and ceremonial spheres across many cultures, they chose their most treasured garments for their wedding day. These garments, often the richest, most carefully kept pieces in a household, might be deep reds, sunlit yellows, or elaborately patterned silks and linens, each hue and motif quietly carrying meanings only fully known to those who wove, maintained, and selected them. White, if it appeared at all in these contexts, was rarely associated with celebration or joy. Rather, it often symbolized mourning, a quiet acknowledgement of loss or reflection, rather than of innocence or purity. It is a curious detail, perhaps unnoticed by the modern eye, that the association of color with moral or emotional symbolism could vary so profoundly from one region to another, and even within a single community, context could alter the significance entirely. One might imagine, softly and almost imperceptibly, the texture of these dresses, the feel of dyed fabrics under practiced fingers, the gentle sheen of materials kept for decades, and the careful deliberation behind choosing what would be worn for a ceremony both intimate and socially meaningful. Each choice, though perhaps mundane to an observer centuries later, contained within it layers of cultural knowledge, practical consideration, and subtle messaging about status, taste, and familial expectation, even as it carried none of the later, more rigid associations with white as a moral or spiritual marker. And so, we pause. A slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. That in some regions, it was considered entirely improper to select a white garment for a joyful occasion, a detail that may seem tedious now, but was profoundly important in guiding the quiet choreography of daily and ceremonial life. Let us float gently onward through these textures, colors, and social patterns, allowing ourselves to observe, with calm attention, the unhurried evolution of what would much later become the icon of bridal purity, noting that the seeds of symbolic choice were already quietly germinating, hidden in the folds of carefully chosen, brightly colored cloth. The very act of wearing one's best dress was itself an expression of value, dignity, and personal care, an intimate ritual that balanced practicality, beauty, and the quiet messages sent to those present. It was in this environment of softly patterned and richly hued garments that the narrative of bridal attire began its slow, centuries-long journey toward the associations we recognize today, though no one could have foreseen the eventual centrality of white, nor the intricate cultural and economic forces that would elevate it so delicately above all others. And as we settle, drifting into the 16th century, we notice a subtle shift, like the gentle turning of a weathered gear, a quiet change in European society where white, though still not linked to moral purity, began to acquire a new, practical prestige. Here, white became a symbol not of virtue, but of wealth, for the maintenance of pristine, bleached fabric required labor, resources, and care that were out of reach for most households. The bleaching processes of the time were meticulous and slow, often involving repeated soaking in sunlight or in alkaline solutions, and these procedures were far from guaranteed, sometimes yielding only slightly off-white results, which were nonetheless highly valued. One can almost feel the sun-warmed linen laid across rough wooden racks, turning slowly in the breeze, while servants and laundresses monitored each piece with a patience that seems almost unbearable in its quiet tedium. To own and display such a fabric was to convey social position, financial stability, and a capacity for leisure, a subtle whisper of prestige that spoke volumes without any need for ornamentation or overt declaration. And within the noble circles of France and Italy, white garments were sometimes chosen for brides, not to signal innocence or virtue, but to quietly announce status, affluence, and the ability to access rare, costly materials. Let us pause here. For this extra detail. That the desire for white was, in a way, practical. Dirt and stains were harder to hide, so only those with sufficient means could hope to maintain the fabric's immaculate appearance over the course of a ceremony and the subsequent celebrations. The symbolic meaning, therefore, lay not in abstract morality, but in the very real, tactile experience of clean, luminous fabric, painstakingly maintained. And so we drift, ever so slowly, through these social and material layers, noting that color, texture, and accessibility were intimately tied, and that what might seem a trivial preference was in fact a carefully considered, socially meaningful choice, shaping the subtle expectations and quiet signals of elite wedding ceremonies, long before white became the emblem of purity that we now imagine so automatically. Within these same decades, the soft glow of noble ambition in France and Italy allowed white to occasionally grace bridal attire as a gentle declaration of rank and refinement. Brides of noble families sometimes selected garments in pale, luminous shades, a decision made less for sentiment and more as an unspoken display of wealth, influence, and familial distinction. The practice was neither widespread nor standardized. It floated delicately amid the broader spectrum of available colors and patterns, which continued to reflect local tastes, resources, and traditions. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that the occasional adoption of white among the elite required not only access to high-quality bleached linen or silk, but also the maintenance of servants trained in the gentle arts of cleaning, starching, and preserving the fabric's subtle brilliance. One can imagine the slow, tender movements of these attendants, brushing, washing, and hanging the cloth in the sun, while the bride herself might have been absorbed in entirely different concerns, unaware of the exact effort required to present her gown at its optimal luminous state. Let us drift gently onward, considering how this early association of white with material sophistication laid a quiet foundation for later shifts in symbolism, when whiteness would come to embody purity, innocence, and moral virtue in addition to wealth. Yet in this early stage, the color's primary resonance was economic, a visual shorthand for resources and social standing, rather than a spiritual or ethical statement. And so, as we linger in this gentle examination, the texture, hue, and care of these early white garments reveal a slow, nuanced dialogue between fabric, labor, and human perception, a dialogue as soft and persistent as the drifting light across a mossy forest floor, unnoticed by most, but shaping the landscape of bridal attire for centuries yet to come. In the delicate, drifting hours of the 17th century, let us float slowly into England, where the gentle notion of color began to carry quiet social weight, particularly the pale, almost ethereal hue of white. White, in this period, was not merely a color but an emblem of labor, patience, and expense, for achieving such luminous fabric required processes that were long, meticulous, and not without risk. Linen and fine fabrics had to be bleached repeatedly, often soaked in alkaline solutions, stretched upon racks, and exposed to sunlight for days, sometimes weeks, in order to attain the soft, pristine shade that signified refinement. One can imagine, softly, the careful turning of the cloth as it hung on rudimentary wooden frames, the slow rotation aided by gentle breezes, and the ever-present concern of rain or a stray blemish tarnishing the painstaking work. It was not enough to merely own white, it had to remain immaculate, an unbroken canvas signaling the presence of wealth, leisure, and, subtly, social aspiration. The labor required to maintain such a color in an era before modern detergents or chemical whiteners elevated white garments above all others, quietly establishing a hierarchy in which the ability to wear and preserve such fabric whispered privilege to anyone observing. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Even within the textile trade, white was treated with a kind of reverent care. Dyers and bleachers regarded slight variations in shade as noteworthy, cataloging subtle differences in tone that might now seem imperceptible to modern eyes, yet mattered greatly in the silent language of elegance and social signaling. And so, the rarity of white extended beyond acquisition. It encompassed the quiet vigilance necessary to protect it, to ensure that the fabric remained luminous through handling, storage, and eventual wearing, creating a scenario in which only the most affluent could truly participate in the ritual of visible refinement. In these same years, brides themselves often gravitated toward pastel or muted tones, gently reflective shades that concealed stains and allowed a degree of practicality, for the maintenance of pure white was simply impractical outside the wealthiest households. Pale blues, soft creams, and tender yellows offered a balance between ceremonial display and functional care, permitting brides to participate in cultural traditions while acknowledging the constraints of daily life. The soft palette of these gowns harmonized with the slow rhythms of domestic life and public ceremony alike, blending aesthetic choice with pragmatic necessity. White, meanwhile, remained a rarefied exception, a delicate flourish of luxury so infrequent that its appearance in a bridal gown would be noted and commented upon, quietly marking the wearer as part of a social echelon capable of absorbing the enormous demands of care and upkeep. Let us drift gently onward, considering how this careful attention to practicality and hierarchy shaped the very fabric of social rituals, embedding in the choice of color an unspoken communication of resources, taste, and subtle ambition. Even within the muted spectrum, the pursuit of elegance was evident in details, lace trimming, embroidery, and the precise arrangement of layers, all chosen to emphasize refinement without the daunting burden of maintaining a perfect white surface. The slow evolution of taste and textile technology intertwined in these decisions, producing a nuanced landscape of color and materiality that would ripple quietly into future centuries. As the 18th century unfolded, white gradually settled into a more formalized position as a marker of wealth and status, as those fortunate enough to access such fabrics could now wear garments that remained immaculately clean throughout ceremonies and social events. The upper classes, aided by increasingly sophisticated bleaching techniques and the development of specialized laundering practices, could maintain luminous white garments as an ongoing demonstration of refinement and social standing. It was not simply a color but a symbol of the resources necessary to achieve and preserve it: servants trained in washing, starching, and drying, specialized spaces for sun bleaching, and a quiet diligence that ensured the fabric's purity. Let us float gently onward, contemplating how such seemingly trivial minutiae, the angle of a drying rack, the consistency of alkaline baths, the patience required to repeat the process, created an invisible, yet deeply meaningful, code of social conduct. Each fold, each careful brush of a sleeve, spoke softly of wealth, leisure, and the ability to command time and labor, a quiet demonstration of privilege that needed no words. White, then, in the 18th century, became not merely a hue, but a lived experience, a tactile and visual measure of status, and an intricate dance between material, care, and perception, slowly unfolding through the soft patterns of everyday aristocratic life. In the soft unfolding of the 18th century, let us drift gently into a world where the subtleties of color began to mingle with the quiet currents of faith and ritual, and where white, previously esteemed for its rarity and the meticulous care required to maintain it, started to carry a slowly emerging symbolic meaning within Christian wedding ceremonies. The delicate association of white with innocence and purity was not immediate, but it crept quietly into religious consciousness, aided by sermons, liturgies, and ceremonial expectations that valued moral virtue and spiritual cleanliness as much as visible refinement. Let us pause. A slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. That within church records and guides for ceremonial dress, there were often detailed suggestions about the appropriateness of lighter shades for brides, subtly linking the choice of fabric and color to ideals of personal and social virtue, even if such associations were still tentative and unevenly observed across different parishes and regions. White garments, when chosen for weddings, were therefore more than an aesthetic preference, they were a careful, almost whispering nod to the moral and spiritual ideals the ceremony itself sought to express. It is softly remarkable, in a quietly mundane way, that the interplay between material culture, religious symbolism, and social custom created a slow but persistent expectation that brides might, if circumstances allowed, present themselves in pale, luminous fabrics that conveyed both wealth and virtue. This emerging understanding did not dictate universal practice, but it laid the groundwork for centuries of visual and symbolic tradition, gently guiding taste, ceremony, and the very perception of bridal elegance. The soft folds of fabric, the careful sheen, and the painstaking effort to preserve whiteness were now imbued not only with economic meaning but also with moral resonance, weaving together social observation, spiritual reflection, and the quiet poetry of ritualized dress. As we drift gently onward into the 1780s, we encounter Queen Charlotte of England, who wore a white gown for a ceremonial event, a quiet yet pivotal illustration of white's early association with formality and social significance. Her choice, though perhaps unremarkable in the realm of daily aristocratic life, was recorded and noted with care, subtly broadcasting a preference for white as a dignified, ceremonially appropriate color. Let us linger softly on this detail. A slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. That Queen Charlotte's gown, while carefully preserved in descriptions and paintings, demonstrates the interplay of texture, lace, and subtle sheen that elevated the garment beyond simple fashion. It became a statement of decorum, taste, and visual propriety, a carefully measured nod to the weight of tradition and the quiet demands of public ceremony. In wearing white, she participated in a slowly coalescing pattern in which the color, previously linked only to laborious maintenance or social rank, now carried gentle whispers of refinement, dignity, and adherence to ritual expectation. The threads of her gown, the manner in which they caught light, and the very shade she selected contributed to a narrative that quietly reinforced the value of visual and moral order, extending the idea that whiteness could be both aesthetically beautiful and symbolically resonant within the measured rhythms of ceremonial life. In the early decades of the 19th century, the Romantic movement began to sweep softly across Europe, touching art, literature, and fashion with a contemplative reverence for nature, virtue, and the delicate beauty of emotional expression. Let us float gently onward into this era, where the ideals of purity, innocence, and natural grace became quietly influential in the realm of bridal attire, increasing the desirability of white gowns among those who wished to align themselves with these poetic currents. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. That the Romantic emphasis on moral virtue was often conveyed in painstaking detail through visual symbols in clothing, flowing lines, lightly textured fabrics, and pale tones created a visual vocabulary in which the bride's appearance subtly echoed her social and spiritual alignment with the movement's ideals. White, soft and luminous, provided a canvas upon which these values could be expressed, gently linking aesthetics, morality, and the naturalistic tendencies of Romantic thought. This slow coalescence of taste and symbolism did not erase earlier practical or status-based considerations, but it layered them with a dreamy moral resonance, allowing brides to participate in a quiet dialogue of elegance, virtue, and personal expression. We can imagine, with a slow and patient attention, the careful selection of fabrics, the attention to drape and color, and the almost imperceptible gestures of refinement that rendered white both desirable and meaningful, a subtle yet persistent signal of purity, virtue, and alignment with the soft, introspective sensibilities of the age. It is here, in these gentle intersections of culture, fashion, and morality, that the idea of the white wedding dress began to take root in ways that would quietly blossom over the decades to come, an unhurried evolution that rewards only those who observe with patient, contemplative eyes. In the quiet, drifting moments of 1816, let us float softly into the ceremonial life of Princess Charlotte of Wales, who wore a gown of white, though not in the pure, unadorned sense that later centuries would recognize. Her dress shimmered with metallic threads and gentle patterns, a fabric alive with the interplay of light and texture, hinting at the future preference for pale, luminous tones without yet fully embracing the simplicity that would later define bridal white. One can imagine the careful attention paid to the selection of threads, the subtle glint of metallic fibers woven with painstaking precision into the soft, flowing silk, and the gentle rhythm of tailors' hands as they assembled each panel with care. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. The metallic threads themselves were not merely decorative, they reflected the wearer's status and the technical skill available in the textile workshops of the era, requiring both time and resources to integrate seamlessly without disrupting the fabric's drape or softness. In this way, the gown functioned as a delicate announcement of both familial prestige and aesthetic sensibility, a whisper rather than a declaration, a quiet choreography of material, light, and social nuance. The metallic accents, while subtle, also softened the brightness of the white, allowing the fabric to shimmer gently under the filtered light of a ballroom or ceremonial hall, hinting at elegance and refinement, yet avoiding the starkness that pure white would later convey in a more universally symbolic sense. It is fascinating, and quietly mundane, to consider how this interplay of material, pattern, and color hinted at evolving tastes, the gradual privileging of light, ethereal tones, and the careful construction of social meaning through fabric, each fold and glimmer speaking softly to those trained in the unhurried art of visual interpretation, a code of quiet communication woven into silk and metallic thread. As we drift gently onward to 1840, we arrive at the widely observed and quietly transformative moment when Queen Victoria married Prince Albert, choosing a white gown for her wedding, an event that would be chronicled widely in prints, sketches, and the early proliferations of illustrated news. Unlike Princess Charlotte's metallic patterns, Victoria's dress embraced a simpler, paler expression of white, soft and luminous, signaling purity and innocence in a way that became culturally resonant almost immediately. The fabric, carefully bleached and selected, allowed the intricate lace and delicate embroidery to shine without competing with the color itself, creating a visual impression that was both refined and symbolically charged. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Queen Victoria's gown incorporated Honiton lace, a specialty of Devonshire, woven by artisans who dedicated long hours to producing motifs so fine and intricate that each piece required nearly imperceptible handling to avoid damage. In wearing this white gown, Victoria did more than dress for ceremony, she codified an aesthetic and moral language in which white could quietly symbolize virtue, innocence, and aspirational refinement. The widespread circulation of her wedding images allowed the color to migrate from the aristocratic sphere into broader cultural consciousness, a soft whisper that gradually suggested to society that white was not merely a luxurious or difficult to maintain fabric, but a marker of moral and ceremonial propriety, carrying the subtle promise of purity and new beginnings, a visual vocabulary that would be absorbed by generations to come. In the gentle decades following 1840, we drift softly into the 1840s, where the influence of Queen Victoria's widely noted white gown extended quietly into the practices of middle-class brides across Europe and America. Here, white began to be embraced not for rarity alone, nor solely for status, but as an aspirational choice, a delicate emulation of royal example filtered through the practical realities of domestic life. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. The industrial innovations in textile production and bleaching during this period allowed middle-class households to access fabrics that could maintain whiteness with considerably less labor than previously required, making the symbolic gesture of wearing white both achievable and socially meaningful. Brides now sought the soft luminescence of white, often incorporating modest lace or trim, to convey both personal taste and an alignment with the elegance established by Victoria, quietly negotiating the tension between aspiration, practicality, and moral symbolism. The choice of white among middle-class brides also reflected a broader cultural shift, in which the language of color in ceremonial attire could signal moral virtue, social alignment, and adherence to evolving aesthetic ideals, all without a single word spoken. Let us float gently onward, imagining the careful selection of fabric, the soft anticipation of laundering and maintenance, and the quiet pleasure taken in wearing a gown that signaled continuity with tradition, aspiration toward refinement, and a gentle, unhurried participation in a slowly codifying visual culture. In this way, the adoption of white by middle-class brides marks a subtle but persistent shift, an evolution of meaning that extended far beyond mere fashion, threading together labor, status, and moral symbolism in a slow, deliberate dance of social expression. In the soft, unhurried drift of the 1850s, let us gently explore a time when industrial innovations began to quietly transform the landscape of textiles and fashion, making white fabrics increasingly accessible to brides beyond the uppermost echelons of society. The development of chemical bleaching processes, particularly the use of chlorine-based solutions, allowed fabrics to achieve a consistent, luminous whiteness far more efficiently than the painstaking, sun-dependent methods of previous centuries. One can imagine the quiet laboratories and workshops, the slow, deliberate mixing of solutions, the careful immersion of linens and silks in bubbling baths, and the patient monitoring required to prevent over-bleaching or damage to delicate fibers. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Early industrial bleaching was not instantaneous, it required a nuanced understanding of water quality, fabric type, and temperature control, all overseen by textile workers who, though often unnoticed, exercised extraordinary precision in producing the soft, even whites that would become desirable for bridal wear. These innovations subtly shifted the social landscape, allowing middle and even lower middle-class brides to aspire to white gowns, a choice that had previously been confined largely to the wealthy, who could afford the laborious maintenance of sunlight-bleached fabrics. In this way, industrial advances quietly democratized a visual symbol, creating a gentle ripple through social and cultural expectations. Brides could now consider white not only for its associations with wealth and refinement but for the soft promise of ritual purity and ceremonial dignity, a choice facilitated by technological progress and quietly reinforced by availability and practicality. The transition was slow, subtle, and often unnoticed, like the gradual fading of evening light through a misted window, yet it laid the groundwork for the symbolic layering that would dominate wedding attire in decades to come, threading together technological capability, social aspiration, and aesthetic sensibility in a soft, unhurried pattern. As we drift, ever so gently, into the 1860s, we observe a quiet evolution in meaning, where white dresses begin to symbolize the bride's moral virtue and the notion of a fresh beginning in her married life. This symbolic significance was not inherent in the fabric itself but emerged through the confluence of religious guidance, societal expectation, and the lingering influence of romantic ideals. The whiteness of the gown became a visual metaphor, softly echoing ideas of innocence, spiritual purity, and ethical propriety, signaling a new chapter in the bride's personal narrative. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. That moral symbolism in clothing was often articulated in painstakingly detailed writings and etiquette manuals of the time, which instructed brides on appropriate presentation, the subtleties of lace, the folds of fabric, and the gentle interplay of light on delicate textures, all intended to communicate virtue and refinement without overt declaration. The white dress, therefore, functioned as both a social signal and a private affirmation, allowing the wearer to embody ideals of moral clarity and fresh beginnings while participating in a ceremonial tradition that increasingly valued symbolic expression. The soft, deliberate folds of the gown, the quiet gleam of embroidered patterns, and the gentle sheen of polished fabric all contributed to a tableau in which virtue was visually communicated, a slow, almost imperceptible choreography of material, labor, and meaning. It is remarkable in its quietness that such symbolism could be conveyed through the patient arrangement of fabric and careful attention to color, providing a language of quiet moral and social resonance for those who observed closely, a language that drifted into collective understanding with a gentle, persistent rhythm. In the unfolding of the 1870s, let us float softly into the advent of photography, a medium that would quietly, yet profoundly, popularize the white wedding dress and solidify its association with purity in the public imagination. Early photographs, captured through long exposures and careful composition, preserve the soft luminescence of white gowns, allowing viewers across regions to absorb and internalize the visual grammar of bridal whiteness. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that photographic technology of the time required meticulous attention to lighting, fabric reflectivity, and positioning, as early collodion plates and daguerreotypes captured tonal subtleties that could either enhance or diminish the perceived purity of a gown. Brides posed patiently, holding slow, deliberate postures, allowing every fold, lace pattern, and subtle shimmer to be documented in the unhurried medium, creating visual records that carried meaning far beyond their immediate context. Through these images, white became not merely a practical or fashionable choice but a widely recognizable symbol of innocence, moral clarity, and ceremonial refinement, a soft language absorbed by communities and emulated by brides who now had visual exemplars of purity and elegance. The diffusion of these images allowed the symbolic significance of white to solidify across social classes and geographical boundaries, gently embedding itself into the collective imagination. We can imagine, with tender attention, the careful reproduction of these photographs, their circulation in newspapers, family albums, and social commentaries, each image reinforcing the quiet, pervasive understanding that white, in its soft luminosity, now carried moral, aesthetic, and ceremonial weight, forming a slow, persistent rhythm of cultural codification that would shape bridal practice for generations to come. In the gentle unfolding of the 1880s, let us drift softly into a time when white lace began to emerge as a quietly celebrated feature of bridal gowns, transforming simple white fabric into something more textured, intricate, and symbolically rich. Lace, delicate and airy, woven in fine patterns of flowers, vines, or geometric motifs, became a visual language of refinement, signaling an attention to detail and a taste for subtle artistry that complemented the luminosity of white fabric. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that lace production during this period was itself an exercise in patient labor and quiet craftsmanship, often requiring skilled hands to manipulate threads into patterns that could take weeks, if not months, to complete, with artisans observing a nearly imperceptible rhythm in each knot, loop, and twist to achieve the desired softness and precision. In this way, a white lace gown was not only an aesthetic choice but a demonstration of careful labor, societal position, and delicate taste, a slow and almost imperceptible narrative woven into silk and cotton threads. The gentle combination of pristine white fabric and intricate lace carried symbolic weight as well, suggesting moral virtue, the refined sensibilities of the bride, and her alignment with ideals of purity and propriety that were quietly observed and subtly recognized by family, guests, and community alike. One can imagine the soft glint of sunlight or candlelight catching the raised patterns of lace, creating whispers of shadow and texture across the flowing folds of the gown, a visual poetry that communicated elegance, diligence, and social refinement in a manner that was quiet yet pervasive. Brides wearing white lace in this decade participated in a slow, culturally codified ritual in which fabric and pattern spoke softly of moral and aesthetic ideals, a dialogue between textile, symbolism, and human perception that required patience, observation, and gentle appreciation to fully comprehend. As we float gently onward into the 1890s, white dresses became increasingly associated with weddings among the upper and middle classes, quietly solidifying a visual code that linked whiteness to both social aspiration and moral expectation. Yet, in practical terms, working-class brides often continued to wear colored or patterned garments, chosen for durability, ease of maintenance, and continued usefulness beyond the ceremony, a pragmatic choice that contrasted softly with the symbolic luxury of the white gown. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that even among middle-class households, the acquisition and maintenance of a white dress required careful planning, knowledge of laundering techniques, and the allocation of time or domestic labor that was not always readily available, making the wearing of white a subtle indicator of both preparation and social position. The contrast between white-clad brides and those in practical dresses highlights the quietly persistent interplay of economy, culture, and moral signaling, a gentle reminder that material choices in ceremony carry layered meaning far beyond what might be immediately perceived. We can imagine, with patient attention, the careful folding, storage, and occasional washing of white gowns, each action a soft, almost meditative rehearsal of social expectation and ceremonial propriety. The gentle rhythms of preparation, the soft textures of fabric handled with care, and the quiet observation of societal norms all contributed to an understanding that white was no longer merely a fabric or a color, but a delicate visual shorthand for virtue, refinement, and aspirational alignment with social ideals, carefully maintained across households and generations. Drifting further into the 1900s and the Edwardian era, white wedding dresses became even more elaborate, embracing opulent lace, multiple layers, and soft embellishments that spoke softly of wealth, status, and ceremonial significance. The gowns of this period often featured high collars, gently puffed sleeves, flowing trains, and intricate overlays of lace and embroidered fabric, creating a tactile and visual impression of sumptuousness that could be appreciated both up close and from a respectful distance. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that the layering of fabrics, sometimes 3 or 4 deep, required careful planning in terms of weight distribution, seam strength, and ease of movement, as well as considerable patience from seamstresses and attendants to maintain a gentle, fluid silhouette that preserved both comfort and aesthetic grace. White, in this context, was no longer merely a color of moral virtue but a multifaceted symbol. It indicated social position, reflected the ability to maintain delicate textiles, and reinforced traditional ideals of purity and propriety, all while providing an expansive canvas for aesthetic display. Let us float gently onward, imagining the rustle of fine fabrics, the glimmer of lace in soft light, and the measured care with which each layer was arranged, conveying subtle messages of refinement, diligence, and social understanding. In the Edwardian era, the white wedding dress became both a personal garment and a quietly pervasive social instrument, weaving together threads of fashion, morality, and status into a slow, contemplative expression that communicated meaning softly, unhurriedly, and with enduring cultural resonance, a whispering testament to the deliberate artistry and symbolic care embedded in each delicate fold and shimmering thread. In the gentle, unhurried drift of the 1910s, let us float softly into a period when white maintained its position as the standard for formal weddings, a quiet expectation that had been gradually solidified over the previous decades. By this time, white no longer served merely as a symbol of social status, though it retained subtle undertones of refinement and wealth. It now carried a quietly evolving symbolism, softly suggesting innocence, moral propriety, and a gentle aspiration toward societal ideals. Brides, enveloped in layers of luminous fabric, lace, and delicate trims, communicated more than taste. They whispered, ever so subtly, of personal virtue and alignment with social norms, a language understood by those who observed with gentle attention. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that wedding magazines and etiquette guides of the era often included meticulous advice about not only the hue of the gown but the texture, the drape, and the arrangement of ornamental details, suggesting that each soft fold, each lace insertion, and each ribbon was a delicate gesture, encoding virtue and propriety into the very material of the dress. The white gown thus functioned as a slowly codified visual signal, bridging personal choice with cultural expectation, while the quiet sheen of well-maintained fabric reinforced the unspoken ideals of hygiene, care, and gentle refinement that were subtly valued in both public and private spheres. As we drift gently onward, one can imagine the patient attention devoted to laundering, pressing, and handling these garments, all contributing to a soft, sustained communication of innocence and aspirational social alignment. Each bride's choice of white became part of a continuum of cultural meaning, a visually unspoken yet powerfully persistent expression of values, quietly threading together personal ritual, social expectation, and aesthetic sensibility in a slow, contemplative rhythm that could be appreciated with patient observation and reflective thought. Floating into the 1920s, we encounter the soft currents of modernism gently influencing bridal fashion, where simpler white gowns began to emerge, emphasizing streamlined silhouettes, subtle fabric textures, and understated elegance. The excessive layers and intricate ornamentation of the Edwardian period were gradually softened into garments that prioritized grace, lightness, and a quiet dignity, while maintaining the symbolic resonance of purity and moral clarity. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that modernist sensibilities were reflected not only in the simplification of construction but in the choice of fabrics. Lightweight silks, soft chiffons, and finely woven linens were favored for their gentle drape, minimal need for structural support, and ability to subtly catch natural light, creating a softly luminous effect without the visual weight or complexity of previous styles. The white gown in this era became a canvas for understated expression, where elegance could be communicated through the careful interaction of soft folds, gentle sheen, and the patient placement of minimalist detailing, allowing purity and refinement to be perceived through subtlety rather than opulence. Brides participating in this aesthetic were quietly aligning themselves with contemporary artistic ideals, translating moral and cultural values into a slow, visual language that balanced tradition with an emerging sense of individual taste. The soft flow of the gown, the deliberate economy of ornament, and the careful selection of fabric collectively reinforced a perception of virtue, elegance, and social awareness, establishing a dialogue between the wearer and the observing world that was slow, contemplative, and reassuringly continuous. As we drift, ever so gently, into the 1930s, we encounter the subtle yet pervasive influence of Hollywood films on bridal fashion, where glamorous white dresses were promoted as aspirational, further linking the color with romance, elegance, and virtue. Movie stars, captured in soft focus photography and early Technicolor, provided visual exemplars of bridal beauty, their gowns carefully lit to emphasize luminous whiteness, delicate lace overlays, and flowing silhouettes, creating a quietly persuasive model for brides across society. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that costume designers of the era meticulously considered how each gown would appear both in motion and under studio lighting, softening harsh shadows and enhancing the sheen of fabric to maximize the visual impression of purity and refinement. The association between white, virtue, and romance was thus amplified through mediated imagery, a gentle feedback loop in which cinematic representation shaped public expectation and personal aspiration simultaneously. Brides, viewing these soft, luminous figures, could emulate not only the style but also the carefully constructed symbolism of innocence, elegance, and aspirational social alignment. The gown's flowing lines, their soft lace detailing, and the quiet luminosity of whitened fabrics collectively communicated a moral and aesthetic narrative that extended beyond fashion into the realm of cultural imagination, creating a slow, immersive understanding of white as both a personal choice and a socially recognized symbol. In this era, white became an almost universally legible statement of purity, elegance, and romantic aspiration, subtly codified by film, reinforced in the soft gaze of society, and preserved in the gentle rhythms of ceremony, observation, and careful domestic practice. In the quiet, softly unfolding 1940s, let us drift gently into a world shaped by the vast and slow-moving currents of global conflict, where the demands of World War II quietly but profoundly influenced the practical and symbolic aspects of bridal fashion. White gowns of this era were simplified, pared down to the essentials, with less fabric, fewer embellishments, and a restrained elegance that responded to the realities of rationing and material scarcity. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that fabric rationing was carefully managed by governments and advisory committees, which often provided guidelines for brides and dressmakers regarding the permissible width of hems, the number of buttons, and the use of decorative trim, subtly shaping the visual vocabulary of wedding attire in ways that were soft, bureaucratic, and painstakingly detailed. The austerity of these gowns did not diminish their symbolic weight. If anything, the whiteness of the fabric took on a gently amplified significance, serving as a visual emblem of hope, renewal, and moral clarity amidst uncertain times. Brides, choosing or receiving white dresses during this period, participated in a quiet ceremony of cultural affirmation, signaling continuity, optimism, and the aspiration for new beginnings in personal and social life. The soft folds of the simplified gowns, their unadorned luminosity, and the careful handling required to maintain them in pristine condition reinforced the subtle dignity of the wearer, weaving together notions of personal virtue, practical resourcefulness, and collective moral aspiration into a delicate, almost imperceptible pattern. We may imagine the quiet care taken in storing the gown, the gentle touch with which it was pressed and prepared, and the serene understanding that the simplicity of form could itself communicate elegance, resilience, and moral clarity. White, even in minimal form, became a vessel for optimism, a visual metaphor for the quiet persistence of hope through uncertain days, a softly luminous thread connecting tradition, personal ritual, and social continuity in a slow, contemplative rhythm. Drifting gently onward into the 1950s, we encounter a markedly different atmosphere, a post-war period of increasing prosperity, domestic expansion, and cultural enthusiasm for abundance, in which white wedding gowns returned to fullness, volume, and decorative detail, embracing the softly dramatic silhouettes that had been tempered by wartime austerity. Full skirts, layered tulle, billowing trains, and delicately structured bodices created garments that were both visually expansive and symbolically resonant, emphasizing purity, femininity, and an emerging optimism for the future. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that the construction of these voluminous gowns required careful calculation of fabric quantities, strategic layering to achieve gentle fullness without excessive weight, and patient attention to the balance between comfort and visual impact, a slow choreography of material and labor that underscored the significance of the gown as both a personal garment and a cultural statement. The whiteness of the fabric, enhanced by soft underlayers and subtle sheen, continued to serve as a visual metaphor for virtue and new beginnings, while the generous volume allowed light to play across the folds and textures, softly emphasizing the bride's presence in ceremony and social memory alike. In this era, the white gown became a quiet testament to societal recovery and domestic hope, a gentle assertion that life could resume its rhythms of beauty, celebration, and moral expression, all woven into the patient preparation, careful maintenance, and slow unfolding of material and form. Each train, each delicate fold, and each luminous layer carried meaning, reinforcing cultural ideals through visual softness and deliberate craftsmanship, creating an unhurried dialogue between bride, observers, and the quietly codified language of ceremony and morality. Floating softly into the 1960s, we find a period of gentle stylistic diversification, where white dresses began to vary more widely in cut, fabric, and silhouette, reflecting broader cultural experimentation while maintaining enduring symbolic associations with innocence, moral virtue, and ceremonial propriety. The era saw shorter hems, slimmer profiles, and sometimes subtle departures from traditional ornamentation, yet the color white remained a central visual signifier, quietly communicating purity and alignment with cultural expectations. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that dressmakers and designers of the 1960s often experimented with new materials such as organza, satin blends, and lightweight synthetics, carefully balancing innovation with the maintenance of symbolic legibility, ensuring that the luminous clarity of white continued to resonate even as forms became less rigidly formal. Brides navigating this gently shifting landscape could select gowns that expressed personal taste, reflected contemporary aesthetics, or accommodated practical considerations, while still participating in a slowly codified cultural narrative in which whiteness conveyed virtue, innocence, and moral continuity. The soft sheen of modern fabrics, the gentle drape across shoulders and hips, and the interplay of light with carefully arranged folds allowed the gown to communicate these ideals subtly, creating a quiet but persistent dialogue between material, color, and social understanding. As we drift, ever so slowly, through this decade, we can imagine the careful preparation of the gown, the patient arrangement of accessories, and the soft anticipation of ceremony, all contributing to a sensory and symbolic experience in which white maintained its gentle dominance as the color of ritual, aspiration, and moral signaling. In these quiet nuances, the bride's choice of white continued to provide a slowly unfolding, visually coherent language, balancing innovation with tradition in a soft, contemplative rhythm that could be appreciated by those who observed with patience and care. Drifting softly into the 1970s, we find ourselves amidst the gentle sway of cultural experimentation, when weddings embraced the ethos of the hippie movement, favoring natural fabrics, earth-toned palettes, and a softly unhurried approach to ceremonial attire, yet white continued to maintain its quietly pervasive symbolic resonance, representing spiritual purity, simplicity, and a serene connection to tradition. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that natural fibers such as cotton, linen, and occasionally hemp were chosen not only for their tactile softness and breathability but also for their symbolic grounding in the natural world, their unprocessed or lightly processed textures echoing a philosophy of authenticity, moral transparency, and gentle environmental mindfulness. Brides selecting white within this context were often engaging in a nuanced balance between personal belief, spiritual symbolism, and cultural continuity, embracing white as a softly luminous statement of inner virtue and ceremonial intention, while allowing their garments to drift more freely in shape, movement, and form than had been common in previous decades. The careful selection of white natural fabrics required attention to weave, thread count, and pliability, ensuring that the gown maintained an elegant silhouette without the stiffness or opacity of more heavily processed materials. The subtle interplay of light across loosely draped folds, the gentle rustle of fibers against one another, and the soft contrast of white against the varied greenery of outdoor wedding venues all contributed to a slowly unfolding visual and tactile experience, in which symbolism and aesthetic merged gently. In this way, the 1970s white gown functioned as both a spiritual emblem and a personal choice, a visual and material meditation on purity, simplicity, and the quiet continuity of tradition, drifting softly onward into cultural consciousness without fanfare, yet carrying meaning in every deliberate detail of fabric, cut, and presentation. As we float gently onward into the 1980s, the world of bridal fashion experienced a different sort of quiet spectacle with Princess Diana's wedding in 1981, when her large, elaborate white gown became a widely observed exemplar, reinforcing the connection between white, fairy tale romance, purity, and social prestige. The gown, composed of layers of silk taffeta, lace, and hundreds of delicate yards of hand-stitched fabric, created a soft, expansive presence, its voluminous skirts, puffed sleeves, and sweeping train offering both visual drama and symbolic reinforcement of ideals long associated with whiteness. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that the meticulous embroidery and lacework involved tiny sequins, pearls, and patterns painstakingly attached by skilled artisans over weeks of careful labor, each stitch a quiet affirmation of craftsmanship, patience, and the symbolic weight of ceremonial dress. The luminous whiteness of the silk, complemented by the subtle shimmer of embellishments, allowed light to dance gently across the gown's folds, creating soft shadows and highlights that amplified the sense of virtue, refinement, and aspirational elegance. Princess Diana's choice, and the widespread media documentation of it, quietly communicated that white could encompass fantasy, social visibility, and personal narrative simultaneously, linking the historical symbolism of purity and moral propriety with a contemporary understanding of glamour and public aspiration. Observers of this spectacle could absorb the soft visual language of white, understanding that the color, form, and embellishment together communicated moral and aesthetic ideals in an almost imperceptible, yet persistent, rhythm. The gown's sheer scale, its intricacy, and its luminous clarity acted as a slowly codified lesson in how whiteness could signify wealth, status, innocence, and fairy tale romance all at once, softly embedding these associations in collective consciousness through visual and symbolic repetition. Floating gently into the 1990s, we encounter a period of increased stylistic diversification, where white wedding gowns continued to hold traditional symbolic meaning, innocence, purity, and ceremonial propriety, but also began to reflect the growing emphasis on personal expression, individuality, and aesthetic experimentation. Brides could now select from a spectrum of silhouettes, fabrics, trims, and embellishments, while still participating in the softly codified cultural understanding that white represented moral and social continuity. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that innovations in textile manufacturing, including lightweight synthetics, stretchable satins, and refined organzas, allowed designers to create gowns that maintained the luminous clarity of white while accommodating new silhouettes, softer drape, and unique stylistic flourishes, providing brides with subtle avenues to express personal taste without abandoning the familiar symbolic language of the color. The white of the gown continued to act as a gentle visual metaphor, harmonizing old ideals of virtue and ceremonial dignity with emerging opportunities for individualized aesthetic narrative. The quiet layering of fabric, the soft interplay of folds and light, and the delicate attention to lace, embroidery, or beading all contributed to a slowly unfolding visual dialogue, a whispered communication of social and moral signaling, simultaneously traditional and flexible. Brides in this decade were participating in a contemplative balance between inherited cultural symbolism and the gentle assertion of self-expression, maintaining the luminous association of white with virtue, innocence, and ceremonial propriety, while allowing new variations in style to drift softly across social awareness, subtly shifting collective understanding without abruptness. The softly flowing shapes, the carefully considered textures, and the patient attention to presentation created a slow, immersive experience in which white continued to communicate continuity, personal choice, and the quiet elegance of moral and aesthetic intention, like a gentle feather floating on a calm, undisturbed breeze. Drifting softly into the gentle currents of the 2000s, we find a period in which white remained the quietly dominant choice for wedding gowns, yet there emerged a slowly expanding acceptance of colored accents, pastel undertones, and even entirely alternative gowns, each softly signaling the bride's personal taste and evolving notions of ceremony. The traditional symbolism of white, purity, innocence, and moral virtue, remained present, but it began to share space with a subtle emphasis on individuality, creativity, and the celebratory nature of the wedding itself. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that the introduction of colored accents often involved delicate details, such as ribbon sashes, embroidery threads, or soft beading, requiring careful attention to balance, proportion, and the subtle interplay of light on both fabric and embellishment. Designers and brides alike engaged in a quiet choreography of aesthetic decision-making, considering how soft hues, tonal shifts, and the natural luminosity of white could harmonize to communicate a gentle message of personality, elegance, and celebratory intention. The softness of fabric, the gentle drape across shoulders, and the whisper of tulle or silk under careful movement allowed these gowns to communicate meaning without loudness, maintaining a meditative rhythm of tradition and personal expression. In this decade, the visual language of the white wedding dress expanded, inviting nuanced interpretation while retaining its slow, reassuring dialogue with historical norms. Observers of these ceremonies, even if unaware of specific textile choices, could perceive a continuity of virtue, ceremonial care, and thoughtful attention, subtly woven into the very folds, textures, and gentle shimmer of each gown. In this way, the white wedding dress became simultaneously a vessel of tradition and a softly expressive canvas, capable of communicating heritage, morality, and individual narrative in a manner that was unhurried, immersive, and quietly meaningful. Floating, ever so gently, into the 2010s, we encounter a period where white dresses retained their central role, symbolizing both continuity with historical tradition and the expression of the bride's personal vision of purity, elegance, and ceremonial intention. While modern brides increasingly explored unique silhouettes, fabric textures, and subtle embellishments, the color white served as a softly persistent anchor, reassuring in its quiet symbolism, and harmonizing personal choice with ritual expectation. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that designers in this era often experimented with layered fabrics, varying transparencies, and gentle interplay between matte and luminous textures, all while maintaining the perceptible clarity of white, ensuring that the garment conveyed both visual depth and symbolic resonance. Brides could select gowns that reflected their personal narratives, spiritual ideals, or aesthetic preferences, while the soft whiteness of the fabric quietly communicated moral virtue, ceremonial propriety, and timeless elegance. The careful draping, patient handling, and slow arrangement of these gowns, often coordinated with subtle veils, lace overlays, or delicate accents, created a sensory rhythm in which light, shadow, and texture collaborated to reinforce meaning. In this decade, white functioned as both a medium and a message, allowing personal expression to coexist gently with social codification, creating a softly immersive visual and symbolic experience that spoke of refinement, continuity, and conscious choice. The slow, deliberate movements of the gown, the patient observation of fabric, and the quiet reflection on history all contributed to a serene, meditative understanding of ceremonial attire, in which whiteness remained a soothing and recognizable signifier of elegance, moral clarity, and the unfolding story of ritualized celebration. Drifting quietly into the 2020s, we arrive at a moment in which white wedding dresses continue to coexist alongside an increasingly diverse array of colors, fabrics, and design interpretations, yet they remain the softly dominant choice for traditional ceremonies, quietly signaling ritual purity, timeless elegance, and cultural continuity. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, that contemporary bridal fashion often integrates subtle innovations, such as barely perceptible ombre gradients, minimalist embroidery, and lightweight technical fabrics, allowing movement, comfort, and aesthetic variation while retaining the familiar luminous clarity of white. Brides in this decade may choose gowns reflecting environmental consciousness, personal narrative, or aesthetic experimentation, yet the choice of white continues to anchor their ceremonial expression in a slow, reassuring dialogue with tradition, a gentle affirmation of shared cultural understanding. The soft interplay of folds, the measured drape of skirts and trains, and the whispering textures of layered tulle or silk collaborate to create a quietly immersive visual experience, reinforcing associations of moral virtue, elegance, and ritualized intention. In this era, the white gown functions as a slowly unfolding story, linking past and present, personal choice and social expectation, while coexisting seamlessly with alternative palettes and innovative forms. Observers, whether consciously or unconsciously, absorb this visual language, perceiving the continuity of meaning in the luminous calm of white, its gentle reflection of light, and the patient construction of form. The white wedding dress of the 2020s thus carries with it centuries of cultural symbolism, purity, elegance, continuity, softly reaffirmed through careful design, careful preparation, and quiet ceremonial attention. Allowing both tradition and personal expression to drift together in a gentle, immersive rhythm, quietly unfolding like a feather settling on moss, or a slowly turning gear, soft, deliberate, and timeless. Floating just a little further. Let us imagine the soft intimacy of each choice a bride makes, the gentle deliberation behind fabric, silhouette, and subtle embellishment, as if each decision is a quiet conversation with history itself. The luminous clarity of white, whether paired with a whisper of pastel, a delicate sash, or a tiny embroidered motif, continues to convey both continuity and individuality, like a soft breath shared between past and present. And in this slow, reflective space, the folds, layers, and textures of the gown almost hum with memory, each thread a gentle echo of centuries of ceremonial care, patiently unfolding, patiently reminding us that beauty, meaning, and ritual can coexist quietly, without urgency, and always with a tender, deliberate rhythm. If your eyes are closed, if your thoughts are drifting, then my job here is done for today. Thank you for spending this unremarkable moment with me. You have listened to The Sleepy Sloth, where uninteresting things become the softest lullabies.